Story 1. I'd been working as a night receptionist at the Roadside Hotel for about 3 months. It wasn't much. Just a small, outdated building nestled between a dying town and the endless stretch of highway that ran through it. The kind of place where most nights were quiet, with only the occasional commercial vendor looking for a cheap place to crash before continuing their journey in the morning. That night, though, there was something different in the air. The rain was heavier, the wind more vicious, and the feeling of isolation more profound. I'd been half dozing behind the desk, lulled by the steady hum of the rain, when the door swung open with a creak. A man stepped in, the sudden gust from the storm following him into the lobby. He was tall, with dark hair that fell just above his shoulders. He was wearing a long black coat, dripping wet from the rain, but what caught my eye was the small cut on his forehead. It wasn't deep, but a thin trickle of blood ran down the side of his face. Despite the rain outside, his hair wasn't wet, not even damp, which struck me as odd. "Good evening," I greeted him, trying to sound more awake than I felt. "Can I help you?" He glanced around the empty lobby before fixing his gaze on me. His eyes were a piercing blue, almost unnaturally so. "I need a room for the night," he said in a voice that was low and calm, with just a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Nervousness maybe, or exhaustion. "Of course," I replied, pulling out the registration form. "Name?" He hesitated for a moment before responding, "Jacob." "Jacob Reeves." As he filled out the form, I noticed his hand tremble slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. When he was done, he handed it back to me, along with a $100 bill. "Keep the change," he said before I could mention that the room only cost $50. "Thank you," I replied, offering a polite smile as I handed him the key. "Room 12 down the hall to your left." Jacob nodded, then turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps echoing faintly in the empty corridor. I watched him go, still puzzled by his dry hair and the way he carried himself, as if he was both in a hurry and hesitant to reach his destination. Once he disappeared around the corner, I checked the logbook to make sure everything was in order. That's when I noticed something strange. The entry before Jacob's had been days ago, and I had a sudden urge to check the parking lot. I grabbed an umbrella from behind the desk and ventured out into the storm. The rain was still coming down hard, the wind howling like a lost soul. I scanned the small parking lot, but there was no sign of any vehicles. No car, no truck, nothing. It was just me, the rain, and the unsettling feeling that something was very, very wrong. I hurried back inside, dripping water all over the lobby floor, and returned to my seat behind the desk. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for dawn, for some sense of normalcy to return. But the hours dragged by, and sleep refused to come. Finally, the first light of morning crept through the rain clouds, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I'd made it through the night. As I was getting ready to check out, a loud knock on the front door startled me. I looked up to see Sheriff Daniels standing outside, his face grim. "Morning, Andy," he said as I let him in, his boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. "Sorry to bother you so early." "No problem, Sheriff." "What brings you here?" I asked, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. "There was an accident on the highway last night," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "A bad one." Truck skidded off the road and went right into a ditch. The driver didn't make it. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "That's terrible." "Did you know the man?" "Yeah," Daniels replied, pulling out a small, weathered photograph from his jacket pocket. "Jacob Reeves. Came through town every few months, delivering supplies. Thought you might have seen him around." I took the photograph from him, my hand shaking as I did. The man in the picture was the same one who had checked into room 12 the night before. The same piercing blue eyes, the same dark hair, the same cut on his forehead. This can't be, I stammered, feeling the blood drain from my face. He was here last night. He checked in. Daniels gave me a sharp look, his eyes narrowing. Are you sure about that, Andy? I nodded, my throat dry. Positive. He even paid in cash. Room 12. Without a word, Daniels turned and walked briskly down the hall, with me close behind him. We reached room 12, and he knocked on the door. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time, before finally trying the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, and we both stepped inside. The room was empty. The bed hadn't been slept in, and there was no sign that anyone had been there at all. No luggage, no clothes, nothing. I swear, Sheriff, I began, my voice trembling. He was here. He. Daniels held up a hand to silence me, his expression dark. Andy, Jacob Reeves died in that crash last night. The coroner says he was dead on impact, hours before you claim he checked in. But I saw him, I insisted, feeling the world spin around me. He was here. Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. Look, I've heard of strange things happening at this old hotel, but this. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe you were tired, maybe. I don't know. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the empty room, my mind racing with the impossible truth. Jacob Reeves had been dead before he ever walked through those doors. Before he ever handed me that $100 bill. Before he ever disappeared into the rain. Daniels put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. Lock up when you're done, Andy. And, maybe it's time you found another job. This place, it's not right. I nodded numbly, barely registering his words. He left me standing there in room 12, alone with the sound of the rain and the memory of a man who shouldn't have been there. A man who somehow was. The rain continued to fall, as if the world itself was crying for something lost. And as I stood there, the realization hit me. I wasn't just working at a hotel on the edge of nowhere. I was standing on the edge of something far darker, something that didn't care about time or life or death. And I was terrified that no matter how far I ran, it would follow me.
Story 2. Mark had always been the confident one. He never worried about getting lost, even when we were miles away from anything familiar. But tonight, as the darkness swallowed the road ahead, that confidence had turned into stubbornness. I stared out the window, trying to keep my rising panic in check, but it was impossible. We were driving in circles, and I could feel it deep in my bones. Mark, we're lost, I finally said, my voice tight with frustration. Just stop the car and call for help. Please. He sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Anna, we're not lost. The GPS just needs to recalculate. We'll be back on track soon. Recalculate. We've been driving for hours. I haven't seen another car, another person, nothing. Just pull over. Anna, calm down, he said, his voice laced with irritation. There's no need to overreact. We're fine. Fine? We're in the middle of nowhere, Mark. What if something happens? What if the car breaks down? We're not stopping. That's final. His tone was cold, dismissive. I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I didn't want to fight. Not here, not now. But every fiber of my being was screaming that something was wrong. The road twisted and turned, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the dense forest that seemed to close in on us. The headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness, casting long, eerie shadows. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, we saw it, a flickering neon sign up ahead. "Motel," I muttered, almost in disbelief. "Look, Mark. There's a motel." He slowed down, squinting at the sign. "Looks abandoned." "I don't care. We need to stop. We can't keep driving like this." Mark hesitated for a moment, then turned the car into the gravel driveway. The tires crunched over the stones as we approached the old building. The motel was a relic of another time, with peeling paint, cracked windows, and a sagging roof. But it was a place to stop, to rest, and that's all I cared about. We parked in front of the main entrance, and I could see the faint light glowing from inside the small office. Mark turned off the engine, and we sat there in silence for a moment. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, glancing at me. "Yes," I replied firmly. "Let's just get a room and figure things out in the morning." We got out of the car and made our way to the office. The door creaked loudly as Mark pushed it open, and a small bell rang, announcing our presence. The interior was dimly lit and smelled of dust and decay. Behind the counter stood an old woman, her hunched figure barely visible in the gloom. "Evening," she croaked, her voice rough and aged. "Not many guests around here these days." "We need a room," Mark said, trying to sound polite. "Just for the night." The woman peered at us through her thick glasses, her eyes narrowing. "Not much to choose from, but I reckon I can find you a place." "It's just the two of you." "Yes, just us," I replied, feeling a shiver run down my spine as her gaze settled on me. "All right then," she said, her thin lips curling into a semblance of a smile. "Room 5. Down the hall. Keys already in the door. It'll do for the night." Mark handed her some cash, and she slipped it into her pocket with a nod. "Enjoy your stay," she muttered, more to herself than to us. We left the office and walked to our room. The hallway was dim, the carpet stained and threadbare. Room 5 was just as the old woman had promised, basic but enough for the night. The bed was lumpy, the sheets looked like they hadn't been washed in years, and there was a thick layer of dust on every surface. "This place is disgusting," I muttered, but I was too tired to care. All I wanted was to sleep and forget about the nightmare of a drive. "Let's just get some rest," Mark said, already pulling off his shoes. "We'll figure out where we are in the morning." We lay down on the bed, fully clothed, and despite the uncomfortable conditions, exhaustion quickly overtook us. I fell into a fitful sleep, the darkness of the room blending with the darkness of my dreams. When I awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the grimy window. I stretched, groggy, and reached out for Mark, but his side of the bed was empty. "Mark?" I called out, sitting up. No answer. I got out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold, gritty floor. The room was eerily quiet, and my unease from the night before came rushing back. "Mark?" I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. I hurried to the bathroom, but it was empty too. My heart began to race as I looked around the room. Where had he gone? His shoes were still by the bed, his jacket draped over the chair. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. With a growing sense of dread, I decided to go look for him. I stepped out into the hallway, which was empty and silent. I made my way back to the office, but the door was locked, and no light came from within. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice only echoed back at me. Panic began to set in. I ran outside, scanning the parking lot, and there it was. Mark's car, exactly where we'd left it. But no sign of Mark. I rushed to the car, hoping to find some clue, something that would explain where he'd gone. The keys were in the ignition, just as we'd left them. I climbed into the driver's seat, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? I didn't want to leave, not without Mark, but the growing fear inside me was too strong. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse and sped out of the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. I had only driven a few miles down the road when I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. A police car was pulling me over. I slowed to a stop, my hands trembling as I rolled down the window. The officer approached, a tall man with a stern expression. "Ma'am, can I see your license and registration?" I handed them over, barely able to speak. "Officer, please, my husband. He's missing. We stayed at this motel last night, and when I woke up, he was gone. I don't know what happened, but I need help." The officer nodded, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "Calm down, ma'am. I'll help you, but first, I need you to step out of the car." I hesitated, confused, but did as he asked. He walked around to the back of the car and opened the trunk. I watched in horror as he recoiled, his hand flying to his gun. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered, his voice cold. "What? What is it?" I stammered, my stomach twisting in fear. "Stay where you are," he shouted, and I froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then I saw it. The trunk was open, and inside, lying lifeless and bloody, was Mark. I screamed, backing away, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. The officer was shouting into his radio, calling for backup, but all I could do was stare at the twisted, horrifying reality before me. Mark was dead. His body was in the trunk. But how? I had no memory, no explanation. All I knew was that something terrible had happened in that cursed motel, and now there was no escaping the nightmare. As the police sirens grew louder in the distance, I sank to the ground, my world unraveling around me.
Story 3. The clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and my eyes were heavy, my mind numb from the monotonous drive. It had been a long day of meetings and handshakes, the life of a salesman. I'd driven hundreds of miles, moving from one small town to another, selling my wares and charming my clients. But now exhaustion was setting in, and I needed a place to rest. That's when I saw it. A flickering neon sign that read "Motel." It stood out against the darkness, a beacon of hope for my tired eyes. I slowed down and turned onto the gravel driveway, the tires crunching beneath me. The motel was old, its paint peeling and the windows grimy, but at this point, I didn't care. I just needed a bed. I parked the car and grabbed my suitcase from the back seat. The air was cool, with a faint smell of pine, and the silence was almost deafening. I walked up to the front office, my shoes scraping against the gravel, and pushed the door open. A bell above the door jingled, announcing my arrival. The office was dimly lit, with a musty smell that reminded me of old books and stale cigarettes. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his face wrinkled and leathery, like he'd been carved out of the very wood of the desk. He looked up as I entered, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Evening," I greeted, trying to sound friendly despite my exhaustion. "I need a room for the night." The old man nodded slowly, as if every movement took great effort. "We've got plenty of rooms," he said, his voice raspy. "How long you stayin'?" "Just one night," I replied, pulling out my wallet. He handed me a key with the number 7 etched into the metal. "Rooms down the hall, second door on your left. It's $40, cash only." I handed him the cash, and he took it with a hand that trembled slightly. "Enjoy your stay," he muttered, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. "Thanks," I said, quickly turning and heading down the hallway. The carpet was threadbare, the walls yellowed with age. I found room 7 and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was small and dingy, with faded wallpaper and a sagging bed. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the room. There was a small television in the corner, the kind that probably hadn't worked in years. I tossed my suitcase on the bed and pulled out my phone. I needed to hear Debbie's voice. She was the only thing that kept me sane these days, the only thing that made me feel alive. My wife, Karen, and the kids. They were just a part of the routine now, a life I was desperate to escape. But Debbie, she was different. She was my future. I dialed her number, and after a few rings, she answered. "Gerald," she said, her voice soft and warm. "Where are you?" "I'm at a motel," I replied, trying to keep my voice low. I couldn't drive any further. "I'm exhausted." "Are you okay?" she asked, concern lacing her tone. "I'm fine, just tired," I said, leaning back against the headboard. "I'll be with you soon. Just need a few hours of sleep." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her thinking. "Where are you staying?" she finally asked. Let me check," I said, glancing around the room for any sign of the motel's name. I spotted a faded brochure on the bedside table and picked it up. It's called the Pine Hollow Motel. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Debbie? You still there?" "Gerald, you need to leave." "Right now," she said, her voice suddenly urgent, almost panicked. I frowned, confused. "What? Why? I just got here. I'm too tired to drive any further." "No, Gerald, you don't understand," she insisted, her voice trembling. "That motel, Pine Hollow, it's been closed for years. No one stays there. No one's supposed to be there." "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling a cold knot of fear begin to form in my stomach. "The place is old, sure, but it's not closed. The guy at the front desk gave me a key and everything." "Gerald, please listen to me," Debbie pleaded, her voice cracking with fear. "Years ago, there was a series of murders at that motel. 7 people were killed by the owner. He went crazy, and they never found him. The place was shut down after that. It's been abandoned ever since." My heart started to race, and I felt the blood drain from my face. That's ridiculous. I just checked in. There was someone here." "Gerald, you need to get out of there," Debbie urged. "It's not safe. Please, for me, just leave. Now." I stood up, my hand shaking as I clutched the phone. "But Gerald, please." Debbie's voice was almost a scream now. I glanced around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of the thick silence, the musty smell, the way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room. Panic gripped me, and I grabbed my suitcase, shoving my things back inside. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm getting out of here." I hung up the phone and bolted for the door, flinging it open with such force that it slammed against the wall. The hallway was empty, the dim lights flickering overhead. I rushed toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything Debbie had told me. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. But as I reached the front office, something caught my eye. A photograph hanging on the wall behind the counter. It was old, the edges yellowed and the image faded, but I could still make out the faces. 7 people, standing in front of the very motel I was in. And in the center, with a wide, unsettling grin, was the old man who had given me the key. A chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I needed to get out. Now. I burst through the front door and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys in my haste. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I finally managed to unlock the door and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. I started the car, the engine's growl shattering the silence, but as I put it in gear, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. In the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the dim glow of the rest stop lights. My heart pounded in my chest. It couldn't be. I had left him behind. I had escaped. But as I stared into the mirror, the figure took a step closer, coming into the light. It was the old man from the motel, his eyes glinting with a cold, malevolent stare. Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. I needed to get away, to put as much distance between us as possible. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the darkness closing in from all sides. I kept glancing in the mirror, but the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was still shaken from what Debbie had told me. But the feeling of dread gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing mile. Suddenly, the car began to sputter. The engine choked and then died, leaving me coasting to a stop on the side of the road. I cursed under my breath, frantically turning the key in the ignition, but it wouldn't start. The dashboard lights flickered, and then the car fell silent. I was stranded. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. No way to call for help. The road was deserted, and the oppressive darkness felt like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air prickling my skin. The silence was overwhelming, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No sign of the old man, no sign of life at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That he was still out there, waiting. I took a deep breath and started walking, hoping to find help, a house, anything. But with every step, the darkness seemed to close in tighter around me, the air growing colder. That's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what I knew was there. But I couldn't stop myself. I slowly turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. The old man from the motel, his face twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes dark and empty. How did you find me?" I stammered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just took a step closer. His hand reached into his pocket, and I saw the glint of metal in the moonlight. A long thin blade. "Please," I begged, stumbling backward. "I didn't do anything. Just let me go." His smile widened, revealing crooked, yellowed teeth. "You can't escape what's coming," he rasped, his voice sending chills down my spine. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the asphalt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him, away from that awful, suffocating presence. But no matter how fast I ran, the shuffling footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. I could hear him getting closer, his breath rasping in the still night air. I stumbled and fell, my hands scraping against the rough pavement. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to get up, to keep moving. But it was too late. He was there, looming over me, his shadow swallowing me whole. "Please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please don't do this." But there was no mercy in his eyes, only a cold, predatory hunger. The blade glinted in the moonlight as he raised it high. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. All I could do was watch as the knife came down, slicing through the air with a sickening speed. The last thing I felt was the cold steel biting into my flesh, the warmth of my blood spilling out onto the pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the world faded away into nothingness. And then there was only silence.